Good evening. So received a question this month, and you'll have to forgive me because I normally question more or less exactly as it is written. And in the chaos of the last couple of months, I misplaced the slip of paper that this month's question was written on. But we can at least get the gist of it. Our questioner this month said that they were reading the parable of the rich fool in Luke chapter 12, and you can go ahead and be turning there. So we'll start there. And as they were reading that parable, they started to feel some guilt or anxiety about their retirement savings. That here you've got this rich fool who has said to himself, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. And started thinking about retirement through that lens and wondering whether or not they were sinning by hoarding up wealth for their retirement, and whether it is permissible to save for retirement or whether that constitutes greed. So that is our question for tonight. And I want us to begin with a reading of the parable, and not just the parable, but the context leading into the parable. Because where I want to start with this is that that's not a conclusion that the parable would lead you to, or that it should lead you to. And that'll be shown by the parable itself and by the context of it. So let's start Luke chapter 12, verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I'll do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" One thing that I want us to recognize from this parable is this parable is not a parable about stewardship or preparedness. It's not about a guy who is laying by some money on a regular basis for a rainy day fund or a retirement fund or anything like that. This passage gives us two morals, and they're given explicitly, and neither of them necessarily indicate that retirement savings is just categorically a matter of greed. So consider verse 15. Jesus said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." Now, is it possible for a person, as they are trying to save up for retirement, to fall prey to covetousness or greediness? Would be another. It's not just jealousy in the sense of looking at somebody else's stuff and wanting their stuff. That's normally what covetousness means. The word that's being translated covetousness here can also just indicate just plain greed. Somebody who's saving up for retirement can fall into that attitude of greed. They can fall into that error of thinking that their life consists in the abundance of their possessions. But that's certainly not necessarily the case. The second moral of the story is in the final verse. So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. And there's two conditions there. The one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. We could point to, and we'll name some examples towards the end of the study, some New Testament examples. But I think off the top of our heads, we could probably think of some Old Testament examples of faithful followers of God who were incredibly wealthy. Can you all name some off the top of your head? Yeah, all the patriarchs. They were astronomically wealthy by the standards of their day. I mean, it's like we're looking at Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos levels of wealth that they are holding in their lives. And are they generally counted faithful or not? Well, Abraham, Paul tells us, is the father of faith. So having material possessions does not necessarily make someone poor towards God. In fact, this question kind of plays into some broader anxieties that we tend to have about wealth and possessions overall. Like, am I allowed to have money? Am I allowed to have stuff? Or should I feel guilty about that and try to offload it as much as I can? And it's easy to work ourselves into a state of anxiety over that if we're only looking at the scriptures from one side of things. As we get back into the parable, I want us to consider what this parable, what type of man this is really pointing to. This rich fool is not someone who has been diligently saving up little by little just in case. It says, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. That is, this guy has a singular bumper crop. And now he has to decide what to do with it. He is reacting to an unexpected bounty. And just to get a sense for how extraordinary a bounty this is, look at what he says to himself. Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Now, I know a lot of us don't live in this context or think in terms of this context. But you remember how does everybody in that day and age make their living? What profession is everybody back then? They're a farmer. And up until, honestly, just a couple hundred years ago, most people who were farmers are subsistence farmers, which means that you're producing enough to get by year. Again, just to get a sense for what this guy is looking at and making decisions over, remember in Leviticus 25, when God commands the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee, remember what's not allowed in either of those years. They are not to plant the ground. And so every seventh year on the Sabbath year, they have to go a full year without planting or harvesting anything. And then every seventh Sabbath year, there's another year after that where they can't plant or harvest anything. And so they have to go 2 consecutive years without any planting or harvesting, and not only have to make it through that, but then have to make it to the harvest of the year after that, right? Because just because you've put food in the ground doesn't mean it's ready to eat. Right? The year after the year of Jubilee, you plant in the spring and you don't get to eat until the fall. And there's this anxiety that God brings up explicitly in Leviticus 25. In fact, I think it's probably worth us reading it. Let's see. Leviticus 25:20. And if you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year, if we may not sow or gather in our crop? I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, so that it will produce a crop sufficient for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you will be eating some of the old crop, and you shall eat the old until the 9th year, when its crop arrives, which is long enough to cover them in the event of a jubilee as well. In other words, God is saying that He, by His own divine intervention, will cause them to be, their land to produce enough for them to be able to eat for 3 years off of a single harvest. Right? That is an act of God. And remember, by the way, that Israel never ever does this. They never, at least as far as the Old Testament tells us, we never read of them keeping the Sabbath year. We never read of them keeping the year of Jubilee, because it's just too much for them to believe. Like, what kind of a chump do you think I am, that I'm going to get enough of a crop in 1 year that I'm going to be able to live for 2 years after that, 3 years after that, without planting a crop? Or without having a harvest? That's nuts. Well, now here we have this guy who gets enough of a bumper crop in 1 year that he's saying to himself, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. What this is more analogous to is somebody who's just won the lottery. What do you do with that? And this guy's reaction is hoarding and arrogance. He's going to keep it all for himself, and he is confident that thanks to this bumper crop that he's had, he's got nothing to worry about. Excuse me. Now, can you have that attitude while saving up for retirement? Say you hit 65 or whatever, and your retirement account starts paying out to you. Can you have the attitude, oh, I've got so much money saved up, I'm never going to have to worry? Yeah, you can have that attitude. I've met guys who have that kind of attitude about their retirement. It's far, far more common for me to encounter people who are very worried about whether their retirement is actually going to last the whole time that they are retired, and who are not arrogant like this guy, but who are rich toward God. So the moral of this story is more one of attitude. What does someone do? What is your relationship with the material blessings of this life? Do they cause you, or do you allow them to cause arrogance in you? So just from the analysis of the parable, I don't think that we're led to that conclusion that retirement savings is necessarily sinful. Any questions or comments about that? I've got a few more things to say about this, but just on the parable itself. Okay. So, to answer the question further, outside of the parable, I want us to remember that the New Testament tells us of rich Christians. There were wealthy individuals who were faithful members of the church. We have, as our examples, Lydia, the seller of purple. Right? Selling purple is necessarily a lucrative industry. When Luke tells us in Acts 16, verses 14 and 15, that she is a seller of purple, we're to understand that she's very well off. And she's also faithful, Luke tells us. In Romans 16:23, Paul mentions a couple of brothers. The first one is Gaius, who was a patron of the church, meaning he was wealthy enough to own what we would call today, I guess, a villa a big house, basically, a mansion, the kind that you could host the church in. Your typical, like your average worker in Roman times, in Roman society, would not have had the ability to host a church like Gaius did. They essentially lived in tenements and didn't even have their own kitchens. Whereas Gaius, to be able to host a church, has to be wealthy. In that same verse, Paul mentions Erastus, who is a city treasurer or a manager. And we actually think that we might have found an inscription bearing this guy's name. So again, this kind of position means that he is of means. That poor people don't end up being city treasurer or steward or manager, or however you want to translate it. Philemon, likewise, was the host of a church, and he was a slave owner, which means that he was wealthy. In none of these cases do the scriptures indicate to us that their wealth, just them being wealthy in and of itself, was a problem. In no place does, for example, Paul doesn't suggest that Gaius and Erastus need to, that Gaius needs to sell the house and Erastus needs to step down as city treasurer. Likewise, he doesn't imply to Philemon that he needs to sell his house. He does imply to him that he needs to free Onesimus and not keep him as a slave. But that's a matter of slavery rather than a matter of wealth. And finally, along those lines, I want us to consider what Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17. As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasures for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. And I think this gives us a good indication of what kinds of attitudes we ought to have and what kinds of attitudes we ought to avoid as we are doing things like saving up for retirement. And again, we should understand that in the grand scheme of things, being able to save up money to have a period of 15, 20 or more years at the end of your life where you don't have to work but can still provide for yourself and remain financially independent, that makes us necessarily rich. That's why I'm bringing in these passages about wealth. But these are the attitudes we ought to be looking at. Don't be haughty, that is, don't be arrogant like the rich fool. Don't set your hopes on the uncertainty of riches, like the rich fool. Instead, set your hope on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. All right, and then Paul gives us a short list of things that someone ought to be doing. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. And this goes right along with what John writes in 1 John 3, verses 16 and 17. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has this world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. And so, refusing to give to the needy and using your retirement savings as an excuse, that would be sinful. But this is the thing, and I guess this is the point we're trying to get at, is that it's possible to do more than one thing at once, right? You can do two things at the same time. Most of us are well off enough that we can manage those things at the same time. Okay, so maybe you're putting back a little less into your retirement than you wanted to. Okay, big deal. If there's a need that comes up, help take care of the need, still put back a little in your savings. and it's not like that's a forever thing anyway. Again, we shouldn't get ourselves locked into looking at these as mutually exclusive things. That either you're being generous and doing good, or you are preparing for the future. To some extent, you can do both at the same time. And I want to finish off tonight with some proverbs concerning this, because the proverbs indicate that this kind of preparedness is wise. It's a good trait. Right? In fact, you can probably guess the first one I'm going to quote. Go to the ant, O sluggard. Proverbs 6:6. Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief, officer, or ruler, she does what? She prepares. She prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. Right? Because the winter is coming. The end is, you have to make it through that winter. And the way to do that is prepare. Set some aside. Proverbs 10:4. A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is a prudent son, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who brings shame. Why is that? Because you're going to starve to death that winter. Proverbs 11:24. And this speaks to what we were talking about just a minute ago, about how these aren't mutually exclusive things. Proverbs 11:24. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered. And finally, Proverbs 21, verse 5, the plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. There will come a time in life where you're not able to work for yourself. You're not able to bring in any income for yourself. We appropriately call that the winter of life. We talk about seasons of life. And the scriptures tell us that something has to be done about it, right? That some accommodation has to be made for the winter of your life. There are different accommodations that can be made. The law of Moses and what Paul writes in 1 Timothy indicate that, where possible, those who are elderly or those who are widows are to be taken care of by family, but they have to be taken care of in some way or another. This kind of preparedness, laying by in store for life's winter, is just shrewdness. It's not necessarily greed. Again, can you be greedy about it? Yes. You can be greedy about all kinds of things. But it's a matter of your attitude towards life's wealth and whether or not you are willing to do good with what the Lord has given you. All right, any final questions or comments before we wrap it up? Wayne.
Scriptures you've already mentioned them, but I just want to add these to them if I could. Hebrews 13 verse 16 says, "Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God."
Yes,
that's a part of your sacrifices is to share.
And actually, if I'm remembering correctly, can you read the next verse as well?
Sure. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account.
All right, I misremembered. I know it's in that passage somewhere, though. Oh, yes. Okay. So in that same passage, just a few verses earlier, Hebrews 13, verse 2, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Mm-hmm. Right, so, of course, what story is the Hebrew writer alluding to there when he talks about entertaining angels unawares? Mm-hmm. Abraham. All right, Abraham You might remember when the Lord and his angels showed up at Abraham's tent, he had Sarah make an absurd amount of bread, like just a huge feast of food. He was hospitable to strangers, but he took care of those who were in need. Did he become poor doing that? Did he destroy his own future by having Sarah make up a whole bunch of bread? No. Again, these are not mutually exclusive things that we're talking about. So excellent. And you had another passage as
yes, well. This is kind of the opposite, but I don't think it's sinful to go the opposite way, because it's also included in the scripture here as you could want to be a certain person that would not be super rich or anything like that. In Proverbs, and you were reading Proverbs 30, verse 7, starting there, verse 30. 2 things I ask of you, deny them not to me before I die. Remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches.
Yeah.
Feed me with the food that's needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of our Lord.
Yep, that's an excellent proverb. I'm reminded of the example of Paul. You're talking about cutting the opposite direction. You might remember that Paul, in his dealings with Corinth, refused to accept any kind of patronage from them. And we'll come to it in our sermon series here in a few weeks. But he makes the case that he has the right to receive some patronage from them, but he chooses not to in their case. And in that case, it's specifically having to do with, he knows what it's going to do to them in the kind of culture that they come from. But we know that Paul generally did not claim much for himself. And we think of people who, there are some people in this life who forsake all worldly goods and take what's sometimes called a vow of poverty, where they sell off all of their stuff. They aim to own very, very little and don't make any kind of retirement provision. That's fine. Right? If somebody wants to dedicate their life to the Lord in that way, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Yeah, go ahead.
Add to what you said it, but you brought it up. But he also said, he didn't want to accept any gifts from anybody, lest it becomes a problem or a burden to them.
Right.
And he didn't want to be a burden to them. Right. But he also said, I work with my own hands.
Yeah.
I put myself to work and I earn my own keep. Yeah. And that way, I don't need to have that given to me all the time.
Yes.
So that's another thing is keep yourself working, and you won't have to be in that predicament.
Louise.
Paul well off at one point in his life because he was was Paul well off at one point in his life? Seems like he was when he was like holding Stephen's cloak. He was kind of over those.
Yeah. At the very least, so I wouldn't be able to speak to materially how well off he would have been, but he definitely had some rank, which counts for a lot. There are a lot of people in this world who can get by without having a lot of material wealth because just their position, their status opens doors for them. And Paul was definitely of that sort. He was not only a very influential Pharisee, but was also a Roman citizen, which we see in the book of Acts opened doors for him. He says that he was born Roman. So it doesn't necessarily mean, like we don't know necessarily where their citizenship would have come from. It could have come from, maybe one of his parents purchasing it. and him thereby being born into it. It also could have come if, assuming that one of his parents was, native-born Roman themselves, it could have ultimately been passed down through either being of Roman descent or even of serving in the legions. There were several different ways that somebody could get their citizenship. But Paul says that his, at least, was by birth. In his conversion, Paul did give up some of the privileges of his status, at least as far as being a Pharisee goes. And nothing that we read in the New Testament that I can think of indicates that he would have been materially wealthy after his conversion. So, Dennis, did I see your hand? Oh, okay. All right, any other questions or comments before we wrap it up tonight? All right, excellent question and excellent discussion. Thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments this evening.